Captain Alex Carter had been through countless battles, each one more difficult than the last, but none of them compared to what he was about to face. The war between humanity and the Esthera aliens had been brutal, and Earth's forces were barely holding their ground. The Sithera were fierce, cold, and ruthless. They had destroyed entire cities, wiped out human colonies, and shown no mercy. But now, after years of fighting, the human military was beginning to push them back. The day had started like any other, dull, hot, and exhausting. Alex's boots crunched on the dry, rocky ground of the alien planet he was assigned to. His mission was simple enough: search for survivors from the recent battle and bring them back to safety. But as he walked across the battlefield, something didn't feel right. The landscape around him was a mess. Crashed Esthera ships littered the area, their twisted metal frames smoking and sparking in the hot sun. The air smelled of burned metal and scorched earth. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of recovery drones, but there was no sign of other soldiers. Alex scanned the area, his hand on the blaster at his side, ready for anything. The Sithera were unpredictable, and this planet was still dangerous. He moved cautiously, each step measured, looking for any sign of life, enemy or friendly. Then he saw her. At first, Alex thought it was a piece of wreckage, just another pile of debris left behind in the chaos. But as he got closer, he realized it wasn't metal. It was a body. A young girl, lying on the ground, her skin a pale blue. Her long, silver hair was matted with dirt and blood, and she was barely moving. Alex's heart skipped a beat. A Esthera soldier, but this one was different. Most of the Sithera he had encountered in battle were trained killers, emotionless and ruthless. But this girl, she looked fragile, almost human. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes fluttering open and closed as if she was fighting to stay awake. His first instinct was to keep his distance. The Sithera had been humanity's enemies for so long. He couldn't afford to trust one of them, especially not now. But as Alex watched her struggle to lift her head, something inside him shifted. She was alone, hurt and scared. It reminded him of the many civilians he had seen caught in the crossfire of this endless war. It wasn't her fault that she had been born into this fight. He approached cautiously, keeping his weapon ready but lowered. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. "Hey, you!" Alex called out, his words echoing in the quiet battlefield. "Are you alive?" The girl's eyes snapped open, and she looked straight at him. Her pupils were wide, full of fear and pain. For a moment, neither of them moved. It felt like the world had frozen, as if the air between them had thickened with the weight of everything that had happened. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex froze. He hadn't expected that. He had heard stories about the Sithera, how they were taught to never show weakness, how their soldiers were trained to endure anything without complaining. Yet this girl was asking for help. "Help you," Alex repeated, more to himself than to her. He lowered his weapon slowly, trying to understand what was happening. "You're a Sithera. Why would you ask me for help?" Her lips trembled as she spoke again, her voice shaky. I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to be like them. Please, don't leave me here." Alex felt a pang of confusion. This couldn't be real. The Sithera were known for their coldness, their lack of emotion. But this girl wasn't acting like the ruthless warriors Alex had faced in battle. She looked lost, scared, and more than anything, alone. He knelt down beside her carefully, glancing around to make sure there were no immediate threats. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "You're part of the enemy. The Sithera killed thousands of us." She flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. "I know," she said, her voice cracking. "I was one of them, but I can't do this anymore. I can't fight. I just want to go home. Please, I'm not like them. Please don't leave me here to die." There was something in her eyes, something raw and desperate. Alex felt a tightness in his chest. He had seen soldiers, civilians, and even children begging for help during the war, but he had never seen an enemy soldier beg like this. She wasn't just a soldier. She was someone who had been forced into this life, just like so many others. Alex's mind raced. His mission was clear: search for survivors and bring them back to base. But how could he leave her? He looked at the girl again. She wasn't just a soldier. She was someone who had been caught up in something much bigger than herself. "Why did you ask for me?" Alex asked softly, trying to understand. "Why not one of your own people? Why me?" The girl's eyes flickered with something like shame. "I don't know. Maybe I knew you'd be different. Maybe I knew you wouldn't leave me." Alex stood up slowly, scanning the area once more. His mind was spinning. Could he really trust her? Could he afford to help someone from the enemy? He glanced back at her, meeting her gaze. She wasn't asking for mercy. She wasn't asking for anything except the chance to survive, to be free of this war. It wasn't an easy decision. Alex had been trained to think quickly, to make tough calls without hesitation. But this was different. Something about this girl made him hesitate. "All right," Alex said after a long pause, his voice steady. "I'll help you. But we need to move fast. The area isn't secure. We'll get you back to our base, and then we'll figure this out." Her eyes widened with disbelief. "You'll help me?" she whispered. "Yeah," Alex replied, offering her a hand. "But you better start talking. I want to know everything. Who you are, why you're here, and why you're willing to trust me." The girl took his hand, her grip weak but firm. She nodded, wiping the tears from her face as she began to speak. "My name is Lyra. I'm not like the others. I don't want to be a soldier. I don't want to fight. I just want to survive. I want peace." Alex helped her to her feet, keeping a close watch on their surroundings. As they started walking toward the nearby hills, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this decision, was going to change everything. For better or for worse. Alex couldn't believe what he was doing. Every step he took felt surreal as he moved through the rocky, alien landscape with Lyra, an injured Asthera soldier, limping beside him. His mind was torn between doubt and confusion. This was the enemy. The same enemy that had killed so many of his friends and comrades. The same enemy that had destroyed entire cities. And yet, here he was, walking with one of them, helping her as if she were just another soldier on his side. "Are you sure you're all right?" Alex asked, his voice filled with concern despite himself. Lyra had been walking slowly, her steps unsteady. He could see the pain in her eyes, and it made him uncomfortable. This wasn't how the war was supposed to be. There were no moments of mercy for the enemy. There was only survival, only the next battle. Yet here was this alien girl, wounded and desperate for help. "I'm fine," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll be all right. I just need to rest for a while." Alex nodded but didn't stop his pace. He had to keep moving. The area was still dangerous. The Asthera might send out search parties, and Alex couldn't risk getting caught. As they moved deeper into the rocky terrain, Lyra stumbled, her legs giving out beneath her. Alex caught her immediately, his arms steady around her waist to prevent her from falling. "Easy there," Alex said, holding her up. "You're not fine. We need to find shelter. You won't make it much longer if we keep going like this." Lyra looked up at him, her pale blue eyes wide with a mix of surprise and gratitude. She was shaking, but she didn't say anything. It was as if, in that moment, she trusted him completely. "I don't want to be here," Lyra whispered, almost as if she were talking to herself. Alex helped her sit down on a flat rock, trying to catch his breath. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. Why had she asked for his help? Why hadn't she just asked one of her own soldiers? Why him? Lyra's voice broke the silence. "I don't want to fight anymore. I never did." Alex looked at her, startled. "What do you mean? You're one of them. You were trained to fight. She nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. I was. But that's not who I am. That's not what I want. Her voice trembled with emotion, something Alex hadn't expected from a Thera soldier. He had seen his fair share of enemies, ruthless and cold, but Lyra was different. She wasn't the enemy he had imagined. I don't know how it happened, she continued, her voice becoming more fragile with each word. When I was young, they taught me that there was nothing more important than serving this Thera empire. We were bred for war. My people, they don't know anything else. We've been fighting for centuries, Alex. I've killed so many. But I never understood it. Not really. Alex listened quietly, unsure of what to say. He wanted to ask more questions, to understand everything about her people, about the war. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply personal in what she was saying, something that went beyond the war, beyond the violence. I thought that if I fought hard enough, Lyra said, her voice breaking, I'd be able to find peace. I thought that if I just followed orders, if I killed enough of your people, that somehow I would be accepted. But I've seen too much. I've seen things I can't erase from my mind. And I can't keep doing this. I can't. Alex was speechless. He didn't know how to respond. He had been trained to think of the enemy as a faceless group, as monsters to be destroyed. But Lyra wasn't a monster. She wasn't like the other Thera soldiers he had fought against. She wasn't some cold, unfeeling alien. She was a person, someone who had been forced into this war just like so many others. I know what you're thinking, Lyra said, her eyes locking onto his with a deep sadness. You think I'm lying. You think I'm just trying to trick you so I can survive. But I'm not. I'm telling you the truth, Alex. I don't want to fight. I don't want to kill anymore. I just want to be free. Alex felt a strange twist in his chest. He couldn't deny it. He could see the sincerity in her eyes. He could hear it in her voice. There was no doubt in his mind that Lyra wasn't just trying to manipulate him. She wasn't trying to deceive him. She was pleading with him, hoping that for once, someone would listen. I don't trust you, Alex said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. I can't. You're part of the enemy. You've killed people. People I knew. People I loved. Lyra flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. Her shoulders trembled, and for a moment, Alex thought she might break down completely. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded as if she had been expecting him to say that. I know, she whispered. I know what I've done, and I'm sorry. I can't change that. I can't undo the things I've done. But I can change now. I want to change. Alex stood there, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What she was asking for wasn't easy. He had spent years hating this Thera. The war had taken so much from him. Friends, family, his sense of peace. And now, here was one of them, asking him to believe that she could change, that she wasn't the enemy anymore. I don't know how to believe you, Alex said quietly. How do I know you won't just turn on me the moment you have the chance? Lyra's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly, trying to compose herself. You don't. I can't make you trust me. I can't prove it right now. But I can promise you this. I won't fight you. I won't hurt you. I just want to survive, and I want peace. Alex could see the desperation in her eyes, but more than that, he saw something else. He saw humanity. The same humanity he had fought so hard to protect. It wasn't about the war anymore. It wasn't about enemies or allies. It was about two people, two individuals, caught in a world that had forced them to be something they weren't. I don't know what to do with you, Alex said, shaking his head in frustration. You to trust you, but you're also asking me to go against everything I've been taught. I've been trained to see you as the enemy. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time I stop seeing everyone as the enemy. Lyra looked at him, a mixture of hope and fear in her expression. She was waiting for him to make a decision, to choose whether or not to believe her. I don't know what will happen after this, Alex said, taking a deep breath. But I can't leave you here alone. I'll help you. But only if you promise me one thing. No more lies. No more hiding. If you want peace, you have to prove it. No one else can do that for you. Only you. Lyra nodded, tears filling her eyes once again. I promise. I'll prove it. I will. And just like that, something shifted between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. A tiny spark of something that could grow, something that could change everything. Alex turned and began walking again, motioning for Lyra to follow. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time, Alex felt like he was doing the right thing. The journey ahead felt strange for Alex. Every step was unfamiliar. He had been on countless missions, but this one was different. As he walked through the rugged, rocky landscape, the weight of the situation hung heavy on his shoulders. He was escorting an enemy soldier, a Sthera, no less, back to the human base. It didn't make sense. Everything he had been taught told him that this was wrong. He was supposed to hate her. He was supposed to see her as the enemy. But as they moved forward, something in him shifted. Lyra walked beside him, each step slow and careful. Her pale blue skin was still bruised from the battle, and the injury to her leg made every movement seem like a struggle. The once cold, distant alien soldier had become something else in Alex's mind. She was no longer just an enemy soldier. She was a person, and more than that, she was someone who was asking for help. She had pleaded for his mercy, and somehow, despite everything, Alex couldn't just turn away. How much farther? Lyra asked softly, her voice still weak from the wounds she had taken during the battle. She had been quiet for a long time, only speaking when necessary. Alex could see the exhaustion in her eyes, and the weariness in her posture made him feel a strange sense of responsibility. We're still a few hours from the base, Alex replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced over at her, trying to gauge if she was okay to keep going. But we'll stop soon to rest. You need it. Lyra nodded, grateful, but she didn't say much more. The two of them continued their walk through the alien terrain. The planet was strange to Alex. He had been here before during military missions, but it still felt like a different world. Everything from the sky to the plants and rocks looked unfamiliar. The ground was rough, and the air had a strange, acrid smell. But despite all that, Alex couldn't ignore the silence that hung between them. The silence wasn't uncomfortable at first. There were times when it was peaceful, when the wind rustled through the strange, tall grass that swayed in the breeze. But as the minutes turned into hours, the quiet started to feel heavier. They weren't just walking through an alien world. They were walking through a moment that neither of them could fully understand. It was Lyra who eventually broke the silence. She stopped walking for a moment, staring off into the distance. Her eyes had a distant, almost lost look in them, and Alex could sense that she was deep in thought. "What are you thinking about?" Alex asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. Lyra looked over at him, her gaze soft. "I was thinking about my home, my world, my people." Her voice had a sad edge to it, as if the memories she carried were too heavy for her to bear. Alex didn't know what to say at first. He had never been on the other side of the war, never understood what it was like to be one of the Sthera. He had only seen the damage they caused, the destruction left in their wake. But in that moment, standing there with Lyra, he realized he didn't know anything about the Sthera. He didn't know what drove them, what made them fight. He only knew the pain they had caused. "I was taught that you were all the same," Alex said quietly, unsure of how to continue. "That you were all just soldiers, following orders. No emotions, no mercy." Lyra sighed and turned her eyes toward the ground. "We were trained that way," she said softly. "We were taught to fight, to not feel anything, to never question our orders. But I couldn't ignore what was happening. I couldn't ignore the people we were hurting." She paused, her voice trembling. "I thought I could just do my duty. but every life I took made me feel more empty inside. It didn't make sense anymore. Alex listened intently. Her words were heavy, and he could hear the regret in her voice. It was like a confession, something she had been carrying for a long time. He wanted to ask more questions, to understand more, but he didn't want to press too hard. She had already shared so much, more than he had expected. After a few moments, he spoke. It must have been hard. I mean, being taught to fight without ever questioning it, without ever thinking about the people you were hurting. Lyra nodded. It was. But I didn't know any other way. That was how we were raised. She took a deep breath, wiping a tear from her cheek. When I first saw your people, humans, I mean, I didn't understand you. I didn't understand why you fought so hard, why you resisted. I thought you were just weak. But now I see something different. Alex was surprised by her words. He had always been taught that this Thera saw humanity as weak. They thought of them as nothing more than insects to crush underfoot. But hearing Lyra say the opposite, it made him stop and think. Maybe there was more to this war than he realized. Maybe the Cythera didn't just see humans as enemies. Maybe they saw something in them they didn't understand either. What do you see now? Alex asked, curious. Lyra looked at him, her expression thoughtful. I see strength. I see determination. I see the will to survive, no matter the cost. Her voice grew stronger, more confident. I didn't understand that before. I thought that if you just kept fighting, you'd eventually win. But I see now that it's not just about fighting. It's about living. It's about what you're fighting for. Alex felt a strange weight lift off his chest. For a moment, the war didn't feel so real. The bloodshed, the hatred, it all seemed distant, like it was happening in some other world. But standing here, with Lyra, he realized that this was his reality. This was the world he lived in now. He let out a deep breath. Yeah, we fight for something bigger than just survival. We fight for what's right. For peace. For a future where we don't have to kill each other. Lyra's eyes softened. She smiled weakly. Maybe that's why I wanted to be different. Maybe that's why I came to you for help. She paused. I'm not just fighting anymore. I'm trying to find my place in all of this. I want to believe that it's possible for people like me to change. Alex thought about her words for a moment. He wasn't sure if she could ever fully change. The Cythera were a powerful empire, and they had shown no mercy. But maybe, just maybe, Lyra could be different. Maybe she could prove that people, even soldiers raised for war, could change. All right, Alex said finally, breaking the silence. Let's keep going. We'll rest soon, but we need to get to the base first. We'll figure everything out there. Lyra nodded, her face brighter now. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not leaving me behind. Alex felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just duty anymore. It was something more. He wasn't sure what was going to happen, but he knew one thing for sure. This was a turning point. Not just for him, but for Lyra too. And so, they continued on their journey. The terrain got steeper, the rocks sharper. The journey wasn't easy, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a deep orange glow over the alien landscape. But despite the challenges, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening. He wasn't just guiding an enemy soldier to safety. He was guiding someone toward change, toward a new future. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Alex didn't feel like he was walking alone. And that, he realized, was the first step toward peace. The days that followed felt like a strange blur to Alex. What had started as a mission to protect his people had turned into something entirely different. He had spent so much of his life thinking of the Cythera as enemies, but now, with every step he took beside Lyra, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was changing in ways he didn't understand. They had made it to the base just before the sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays casting long shadows across the alien terrain. Alex had kept a watchful eye on Lyra, making sure she was okay. And though she was still weak from her injuries, there was something in her that seemed stronger now. She was no longer the broken soldier he had met just days before. She was healing, both physically and emotionally. As they approached the human base, Alex's mind raced. He knew that when they got there, everything would change. They would be surrounded by soldiers, and there was no guarantee they would believe Lyra's story. No one would trust her, not after everything this Cythera had done. And yet, despite the odds, Alex found himself hoping that there was a way forward, that there was a way for people like him and Lyra to break free from the cycles of hatred and war. "Are you sure about this?" Alex asked as they reached the entrance to the base. His voice was quiet, but the uncertainty in it was clear. Lyra nodded, though her eyes were filled with doubt. "I don't know what will happen, Alex, but I know that I can't go back to the life I had. I can't go back to being the soldier. I want something more than that." He looked at her, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. But there was none. She was sure about this. She wanted to change. But the question was, would the others understand? Would they let her? Would they accept her? Before Alex could say anything else, the entrance opened, and several soldiers emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn. They had been waiting for his return, ready to assist with the wounded and report on the mission's progress. But when they saw Lyra standing beside Alex, their faces changed from curiosity to suspicion. "Who is this?" One of the soldiers barked, his hand resting on his rifle. "What's going on, Sergeant?" Alex held up his hands, signaling for calm. "She's not an enemy. She's not a threat." His voice was steady, but he could feel the weight of their gazes. They didn't believe him. They couldn't, not yet. The soldier who had spoken scoffed. "Not a threat. You expect us to believe that? After everything this Cythera has done? I know it's hard to believe," Alex said, stepping forward. "But I've seen her. I've talked to her. She's not like the others. She doesn't want to fight anymore." For a moment, the soldiers stood in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Alex and Lyra. Lyra stood silently, her head bowed. She wasn't expecting their trust. She knew that earning it would take time, and she was willing to wait. She had come this far. She could wait a little longer. "Let's get her inside," Alex said, his tone firm. "I'll vouch for her. She's not here to harm anyone. I'll take full responsibility." The soldiers exchanged skeptical glances, but after a moment of hesitation, they lowered their rifles. One of them nodded. "All right, but if anything goes wrong, it's on you, Sergeant." Alex nodded, relieved. He led Lyra inside the base, her steps still slow but stronger than before. As they walked, Alex couldn't help but notice how much she had changed in just a few short days. Her eyes, which had once been filled with fear and uncertainty, now held a quiet determination. Her posture was less hunched, more confident, though she was still clearly in pain. It was as if, by walking away from the life she had known, she had found a part of herself that had been buried for so long. They reached the infirmary, where Lyra would be treated for her injuries. Alex helped her to a bed, and as the medical staff got to work, he stepped back to give them space. He didn't know what would happen next. Would they accept her? Would they be willing to give her a chance? As the hours passed, Alex found himself pacing. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was used to being on the front lines, used to fighting and surviving. But this was different. This was about more than just survival. This was about understanding, about breaking down the walls that had been built between humans and the Cythera. It wasn't going to be easy, but it had to start somewhere. Just as the sun began to rise, a familiar voice broke him from his thoughts. "Sergeant." Alex turned to see Lieutenant Harrow standing in the doorway. He had been the one to brief Alex on the mission, and the two had worked together on several operations. Harrow was a by-the-book kind of officer, logical, efficient, and never one to make exceptions. The fact that he was standing here now, looking at Lyra with cautious curiosity, told Alex that something big was happening. "Lieutenant," Alex said, standing up straight. "What's the word?" Harrow crossed his arms, his gaze flicking over to Lyra, who was resting in the bed, her eyes closed as the medics worked on her wounds. "We've reviewed the intel," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "And we've been informed of your interaction with this Thera soldier." His voice had a sharp edge to it, but there was no anger, just an unmistakable tension. Alex braced himself. And Sergeant, I've been ordered to keep an eye on her," Harrow continued. "But here's the thing. You're vouching for her, and you know what that means. If she steps out of line, it's on you." Alex nodded, understanding the weight of Harrow's words. "I understand, sir. But I'm telling you, she's different. She doesn't want to fight anymore." Harrow's expression softened just a little. He'd known Alex long enough to know when he was being serious. "We'll see. But for now, we'll let her stay. You'll be responsible for her movements. I trust you, Sergeant, but this is a risk." Alex swallowed, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He had been afraid that they would lock Lyra up or worse, but this wasn't the worst outcome. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance. And that was all Lyra needed. A chance to prove herself. For the next few weeks, Alex stayed by Lyra's side as she recovered. He helped her adjust to life in the base. Even though it was clear that she was still an outsider, the soldiers treated her with suspicion, and many of them whispered behind her back. But despite the cold reception, Lyra didn't give up. She worked hard to show everyone that she was committed to her new path. She helped out where she could, cleaning, assisting with repairs, and even learning to speak the human language more fluently. It wasn't easy. Every day, there were moments when Alex wondered if they were making a mistake. But then he would see Lyra helping the medics or talking to some of the soldiers, trying to learn more about them. And he would feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. One evening, as Alex and Lyra were sitting outside, looking up at the stars, she spoke quietly. "I never thought I would find peace. I never thought I could be something other than a soldier." Alex looked at her, surprised by the weight of her words. "You've come a long way," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." Lyra replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You gave me a chance when no one else would." Alex didn't know what to say. There was a bond between them now, one that couldn't be explained. It wasn't just because they had fought together. It was because they had both chosen to walk away from a life of violence. They had chosen a different path, and in doing so, they had forged a connection that went beyond borders, beyond species. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that comes from understanding, from knowing that, no matter how hard the journey had been, they had each other now. And that, Alex realized, was enough. The days in the base had been quiet. Alex found some peace in the routine of daily life, patrolling the perimeter, assisting with repairs, and spending time with Lyra, who was still adapting to the new world she found herself in. She was learning quickly. Despite the initial resistance from the soldiers, Lyra had made progress. Her work ethic was hard to ignore. She was determined to prove herself, and bit by bit, the other soldiers began to warm to her. There was still skepticism in the air, but the atmosphere had shifted. But Alex knew that peace, especially on the front lines of a war, was always temporary. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something dark and dangerous. His instincts were never wrong, and his experience had taught him to trust that gut feeling. It wasn't just the tension with the other soldiers. It was something bigger, something brewing in the distance. Late one night, after the base had settled into a quiet hum of activity, Alex stood guard at his post on the outer wall. The sky was clear, but the air felt thick with unease. He kept his eyes trained on the horizon, watching for any movement. His thoughts kept drifting back to Lyra. Every time he saw her, he was reminded of how far they had come together. What once seemed impossible now felt like the beginning of something new. Yet, even as hope bloomed, Alex couldn't shake the reality of the war still raging around them. He heard footsteps behind him, light but steady. It was Lyra. He turned around to find her standing there, her expression unreadable. She had come a long way since the day they had first met, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She was no longer the frightened, broken soldier he had found in the middle of the battlefield. She had become someone else, someone stronger. "I couldn't sleep," Lyra said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet night. Alex gave her a small smile. "Yeah, me neither. Something feels off tonight." Lyra nodded in agreement, her gaze fixed on the distance. "I've been hearing things. Rumors, whispers in the shadows." Alex raised an eyebrow, his senses immediately sharpening. "Rumors? What kind of rumors?" Lyra hesitated, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. "That the Cythera haven't given up. That they're planning something bigger, something that will destroy everything we've worked for." Alex felt his stomach tighten. He had heard similar whispers, but hearing them from Lyra made them feel more real. He turned toward her, his voice serious. "What are you saying? You think they're coming for us?" "I don't know," Lyra replied. "But I've seen enough to know that the Cythera never give up. They'll stop at nothing to achieve their goals. And if they find out that I've defected, if they know I'm here, it could mean trouble." Alex's mind raced. "So you think they'll come after you?" "Not just me," Lyra said, her voice hardening. "They'll come after all of us. They don't care about mercy. They don't care about anything except victory." Alex took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. He had seen firsthand how ruthless this Cythera could be. They were known for their advanced technology, their overwhelming numbers, and their unyielding tactics. If they were planning something, it wasn't going to be easy to stop. But he couldn't let that fear control them. Not now. Not when they had already come so far. "I won't let them hurt you," Alex said firmly, meeting Lyra's gaze. "We'll be ready for whatever comes." Lyra seemed to take some comfort in his words, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "I hope you're right. But I've seen their power, and I've seen how far they're willing to go to win." Before Alex could respond, a voice called out from behind them. It was Lieutenant Harrow, walking toward them with a stern expression on his face. His face looked as hard as stone, his posture tense. Alex straightened, already knowing that something was wrong. "Sergeant, we got a problem," Harrow said, his voice low. "There's been an alert. We've picked up unusual activity in the surrounding area. It looks like the Cythera are making a move." Alex's heart sank. He glanced at Lyra, who had gone pale at the mention of her former people. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Harrow said. "We need to prepare for an attack. They're closing in on us." The reality of the situation hit Alex like a punch to the gut. The Cythera were coming, and they weren't going to show mercy. He didn't know how they had tracked Lyra's defection, but the fact that they had meant they were serious about finding her and taking her back, no matter the cost. The next few hours were a blur of activity. The soldiers sprang into action, securing the base's perimeter and preparing for what was coming. Alex helped organize the defense, gathering weapons and ensuring that everyone knew their position. Lyra, though nervous, was determined to help. She wanted to prove that she wasn't just a liability. She wasn't a prisoner anymore, and she wasn't going to let her past determine her future. "You don't have to fight, Lyra," Alex said, his voice gentle but firm as they worked side by side. "We can get you to safety. You don't have to risk your life for this." "I'm not running anymore," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I've spent too much of my life running, and look where it got me. I'm here because I made a choice, and I'm not going to back down now." Alex hesitated, torn between protecting her and respecting her decision. He knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but if Lyra was determined to fight, then he couldn't stand in her way. By the time the first wave of Cythera soldiers arrived, the base was ready. Alex took his place at the front, his rifle in hand. his heart pounding in his chest. The ground trembled as the Thera forces advanced. They were heavily armed, their silhouettes dark against the rising moon. The sound of their heavy footsteps echoed in the air as they approached, the tension so thick it felt like it could suffocate. Lyra stood beside Alex, her eyes locked on the enemy forces. She had no weapons, but she was ready. She had been ready for a long time. This was her fight now, too. This wasn't just about protecting her. It was about proving to everyone, especially herself, that she was more than a soldier of war. She was a person with the ability to choose a different path, and she wasn't going to let her past dictate her future. As the Thera forces came into view, Alex felt the rush of adrenaline that always accompanied battle. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for Lyra's future, for the possibility of a world where humans and Cythera didn't have to be enemies. The first shots rang out, and the battle began. It was chaos. The sound of gunfire, the roar of engines, the sharp crack of energy blasts filled the air. Alex fought with everything he had, his training taking over as he moved through the battlefield. Lyra fought beside him, using her speed and agility to outmaneuver the enemy forces. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the possibility of change. But the Cythera were relentless. Their numbers seemed endless, and their weapons were far superior. Every time Alex thought they had gained ground, they were pushed back. It was clear that the Cythera weren't just after Lyra. They were after everything. They wanted to crush any hope of peace before it had the chance to grow. Alex could feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for the future, and if they didn't hold their ground, everything they had worked for would be destroyed. He glanced over at Lyra, who was holding her own, but he could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of losing the chance for a new beginning. And that, more than anything, pushed Alex to keep fighting. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let them down. The battle raged on, the threat of the Cythera growing stronger with each passing minute. But as long as Alex and Lyra were standing side by side, they wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The battle had been longer and more intense than Alex had anticipated. The Cythera forces had pushed hard, showing no mercy in their assault. But the humans, Alex, Lyra, and the rest of the soldiers, had fought with everything they had. There was no choice but to stand firm. This Cythera had come to destroy, but they hadn't expected the kind of resistance they encountered here. As the last of the enemy forces retreated into the distance, the base lay in ruins, but it had survived. The cost had been high, with many lives lost, and the damage to the base was extensive. Yet, despite the chaos, there was a sense of quiet triumph in the air. The humans had won, and in the process, they had gained something that had once seemed impossible: a chance for peace, a chance for change. Alex stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun had just started to rise, its warm light creeping over the land, illuminating the destruction. He felt a mix of exhaustion and relief in his bones, but there was something else there too, a feeling that had been building ever since the battle had started. It was hope. Lyra stood beside him, her expression unreadable as she stared out at the remains of the battlefield. Her face was streaked with dirt, her clothes torn and stained with blood. But there was a fire in her eyes. She had fought for her new life. She had fought for a future that wasn't dictated by the war she had been born into. "We did it," Lyra said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Alex nodded, his hand still gripping the rifle in his hands. "We did, but it's not over. Not yet." They had won this battle, but Alex knew the war wasn't finished. The Cythera were still out there, and their hatred for humanity hadn't vanished with one victory. The peace they dreamed of wasn't something that could be achieved overnight. It was going to take more than just a single battle to change the course of history. But that didn't mean they couldn't start now. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes locking with his. What happens next, Alex? What do we do now? Alex exhaled slowly, considering her question. It was a question he had been asking himself ever since he first met her. What did they do next? What was the right path forward? I don't know, he admitted, his voice low. But I think we've proven that things can change. That there's a future where humans and Cisthera don't have to be enemies. Lyra smiled, though it was faint. Maybe. But it's going to take more than just hope. It's going to take trust. He nodded, knowing she was right. Trust. It was something that had been in short supply between their two races for centuries. The humans had always viewed the Cisthera as the enemy, and the Cisthera had viewed the humans as inferior, weaker, and unworthy of peace. Breaking that cycle would take time. It would take effort. But Lyra had already taken the first step by leaving the Cisthera army behind. And now, Alex was taking the second step by standing beside her, even when the rest of the world didn't understand. We can start with us, Alex said, his voice growing stronger. We can show them that it's possible, one step at a time. Lyra nodded, her face thoughtful. And we'll have to do it together. Alex smiled at her, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. Together, he agreed. As the day wore on, the base was put to work. Soldiers who had survived the battle began to clear the wreckage, assess the damage, and tend to the wounded. The medical team was overwhelmed, but they were doing their best to help everyone. Alex joined in, lending a hand wherever it was needed. He didn't have time to rest. There was too much to do. The battle had been won, but the war wasn't over yet. Lyra was busy too, helping with repairs and checking in on the other soldiers. Though her role was still uncertain, one thing was clear. She was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer a soldier bound by the rules of an empire she didn't believe in. She was a free woman now, and she would fight for that freedom. As the evening came, Alex found himself alone on the rooftop of the base, looking out over the valley. The sun was setting, casting everything in a golden hue. The distant mountains, once shrouded in the darkness of war, now seemed to glow with a quiet promise. It was a beautiful sight, but there was something more important on his mind. The future. Lyra appeared beside him, her footsteps soft but steady. She stood beside him without saying a word, both of them looking out over the landscape. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding, of two people who had fought side by side and had come to understand the weight of the world they lived in. I think, Lyra said finally, her voice quiet, I think we've just started something. Alex turned to look at her, a spark of curiosity in his eyes. Started something. A new beginning, she said, meeting his gaze. A new way. A way that's not just about fighting. It's about building. About finding peace where there was none before. Alex's heart stirred at her words. He had spent so much of his life thinking that peace was impossible, that it was something only dreamed about by people who had never known war. But Lyra had shown him otherwise. She had shown him that peace wasn't just an idea. It was a choice. And it wasn't just about stopping the violence. It was about forging new paths, making new connections, and understanding each other in ways that went beyond fighting. We can do it, Alex said, his voice filled with resolve. We have to. Lyra smiled, the weight of the past few days lifting from her shoulders. Then let's start. It wasn't going to be easy. They both knew that. There were still many obstacles to overcome. The Cisthera would continue to be a threat. The world they lived in wasn't ready for the kind of change that Alex and Lyra were dreaming of. There were still enemies to face, still battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, they had hope. Hope that peace wasn't impossible. Hope that one day, humans and Cisthera could live together, not as enemies, but as equals. As the night stretched on, Alex and Lyra stayed on the rooftop, watching the stars appear in the sky. The war was far from over, but something had changed. The first seeds of peace had been planted. And no matter how hard the road ahead might be, they